I thought I had everything under control until my world crumbled in front of everyone. The moment my husband's voice echoed through the country club, revealing my deepest betrayal, I felt the ground vanish beneath me. What happens when the man you underestimated turns out to be the one holding all the power? The ballroom fell silent. Champagne glasses froze midair. Eyes darted between me and my husband, my quiet, simple mechanic husband, who now stood at the podium gripping the microphone like a man prepared to dismantle an entire empire. And that empire was me. My breath hitched, my hands trembled around the stem of my wine glass, the deep red liquid swirling ominously inside. Across the room, Nathan shifted beside me, his jaw tightening, his perfectly pressed tuxedo now feeling suffocatingly tight. I wanted to move, to run, but my heels felt cemented to the floor. Daniel's voice, steady, calm, almost unnervingly collected, rippled through the crowd. "I have always believed a marriage should be built on trust," he began, scanning the room. His gaze landed on me, pinning me in place. And yet, sometimes, trust is misplaced. Murmurs spread, gasps, a hush of disbelief. This couldn't be happening. I had spent months crafting my secret life with Nathan. I had been careful, smart. I had convinced myself Daniel was too naive, too small to ever notice. But now, under the glare of the country club's golden chandeliers, I realized something chilling. Daniel had known. He had always known. And he had waited for this moment to destroy me. 6 months earlier, I used to think my life was perfect. I was Sophia Whitmore, a woman who had everything. A pristine mansion in an exclusive gated community, a circle of elite friends, access to the finest boutiques and country clubs, and, of course, a devoted husband. Daniel was reliable, steady, predictable. He never made waves, never craved attention. And that was precisely the problem. He was just a mechanic, not a CEO, not a hedge fund manager, not a man who understood the world I had been raised in. We had married young, love-struck and hopeful, but over the years, something shifted. I watched my friends flaunt their luxury vacations, their diamonds, their husbands who made power moves. And Daniel? He was content running his tiny auto repair shop, coming home covered in grease, greeting me with a tired but loving smile. I should have felt grateful. I tried to feel grateful, but deep down I resented him. I wanted more. And then he walked into my life. Nathan Kensington, the very embodiment of everything Daniel was not, the beginning of the end. It started at the country club charity gala, one of the many events Daniel avoided, leaving me to attend alone. I was sipping a flute of Dom Perignon when I first noticed him. Chiseled jaw, expensive suit, the kind of effortless confidence that made women lean in closer when he spoke. He caught my eye from across the room and smirked. Just like that, my life started to spiral. The first temptation. The flirtation was subtle at first, a brush of his fingers when handing me a cocktail, a lingering glance that made my skin prickle with excitement. I had been married for years, but no one had made me feel the way Nathan did. He listened, he complimented me, he saw me in a way Daniel hadn't in years. That night, as I slipped into bed next to my husband, I could still feel Nathan's gaze burning into my skin. Daniel turned to me, his voice groggy. "You have fun tonight?" "Of course," I murmured, forcing a smile. "Just the usual charity chatter." I lied so easily. And that was the moment I realized I wasn't going to stop. The shift. Over the next few weeks, Nathan became my escape. It started with a chance lunch at a downtown bistro, Then a business dinner that wasn't business at all. Each time I told myself it was innocent, that I was only enjoying his company. But deep down, I knew I wanted him. And one night, when Daniel was working late and Nathan invited me to his penthouse suite overlooking the city, I didn't say no. I should have, but I didn't. The double life began. The thrill was intoxicating. Sneaking around, stolen kisses in the back of luxury cars, whispered phone calls late at night. I had never felt more alive. I told myself Daniel would never find out. He was too busy under the hoods of cars to notice the woman his wife was becoming. I convinced myself he was too simple to suspect anything, but I had underestimated him, and I would pay the price. The affair became a rhythm, a second life woven so seamlessly into my real one that I almost forgot there had been a time before it. Nathan and I became experts in our deception. He would send a single text, one that carried a promise in so few words, and I would find a way to be there. A dinner turned into a night in a hotel suite overlooking the city, the sheets twisted around our bodies as we lay breathless from the thrill of indulgence. An afternoon of shopping turned into secret moments in a private dressing room, his hand sliding over silk as I tried on a new dress. I told myself it was nothing serious, just excitement, just something to fill the empty spaces of my life that Daniel never seemed to notice. At home, Daniel remained the same, steady, predictable, unaware. He kissed me goodnight, cooked breakfast on Sundays, and left for work with grease-stained hands and an unassuming smile. He never questioned where I had been when I came home late, never looked twice when I wore new jewelry or perfume, never doubted me when I canceled dinner plans because I was suddenly exhausted. It almost disappointed me how easy it was. Shouldn't he notice? Shouldn't he care enough to wonder? But he didn't, and that only fueled my resentment. I told myself that if he had been more attentive, more passionate, more of what I needed, I wouldn't have needed Nathan. There was something intoxicating about knowing I had a secret, something just beneath the surface of my carefully curated life. It made everything sharper, brighter. It wasn't just Nathan I craved. It was the deception, the danger, the feeling of getting away with something. The thrill of stepping out of my life and into another, one where I was desired, where I was the center of someone's attention, where I wasn't just a wife waiting for a husband who came home tired, but the cracks began to form in ways I hadn't anticipated. One evening, I walked into the country club for a luncheon wearing a dress Nathan had picked out for me, deep emerald silk that hugged my body in a way that felt almost scandalous. As I settled into my seat, a waiter set down a glass of wine in front of me before I had even ordered. Confused, I looked up and he simply nodded toward the bar. There, standing casually with his hands in his pockets, was Daniel. He had never once stepped foot in the country club before. He had never cared for these events, always dismissing them as a waste of time and money. And yet here he was, watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. For the first time in months, a flicker of unease spread through me. I forced a smile and lifted the glass in silent acknowledgement before turning back to my table. My pulse thrummed in my ears, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe he had finally taken my advice and was trying to fit into my world. Maybe he was just being a good husband. But the way he looked at me, the slow, unreadable study of my every movement, made my skin feel too tight. Later that night, as I stood in our walk-in closet slipping out of my dress, Daniel leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me in silence. I kept my back to him, pretending not to notice the weight of his gaze. Finally he spoke, his voice as even as ever, but there was something unfamiliar beneath it, something I couldn't place. "You looked beautiful today." I turned, giving him a small smile as I unhooked my earrings. "Thank you. It was a nice event. You should come to more of them." He hummed, stepping forward until he was close enough that I could smell the faint traces of motor oil on his skin. the scent that once felt like home but now felt foreign. Maybe I will. It seems like a lot happens at that club. The air in the room changed, something subtle but undeniable. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. Nothing happens there except rich people talking about themselves. He tilted his head slightly, his lips quirking into something that wasn't quite a smile. Is that so? The way he said it made my stomach twist. But then he kissed my forehead, murmured something about taking a shower, and walked away as if nothing had happened. I exhaled slowly, forcing my heartbeat to settle, pushing away the nagging feeling in my gut. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Daniel more, not because he had changed, but because he was suddenly present in ways he hadn't been before. He started showing up at the country club more often, joining in conversations he used to avoid, slipping effortlessly into a world I had convinced myself he didn't belong to. The members warmed up to him quickly. He was charming in a quiet way, an easy listener, the kind of man who made people comfortable without trying too hard. I had spent years feeling like he was an outsider to my social circle. And yet, within weeks, he had managed to make himself a fixture. Nathan noticed, too. One night, as we lay tangled in the sheets of his penthouse, he traced lazy circles on my skin and murmured, "Your husband's been watching me lately." I tensed, the word sending a ripple of unease through me. "You're imagining things." Nathan chuckled, pressing a slow kiss to my shoulder. "Am I? He's been showing up everywhere. I see the way he looks at you." I wanted to dismiss it, to tell Nathan that Daniel was just making an effort to be more social, but something about the certainty in his voice made my stomach knot. The thought of Daniel suspecting something sent a wave of panic through me, but I quickly buried it beneath logic. If he knew, he would say something. If he knew, he wouldn't still kiss me goodnight. But then, small things started happening. My credit card was declined at a boutique. Despite knowing I had plenty of money in my account, the bank informed me that some of our joint funds had been transferred, but when I asked Daniel, he only shrugged and said we had to tighten things up financially. One evening, I spotted him at an expensive steakhouse, having dinner with a man I recognized as one of the wealthiest investors in the city. I had never once seen him speak to men like that. When I asked him about it later, he simply smiled and said, "Just business." Something was happening, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And for the first time since my affair began, I felt something close to fear. Not fear of being caught, but fear that I had underestimated the man I had spent years believing I knew so well. The night before the country club gala, Daniel came home late. I was already in bed, scrolling through messages from Nathan, my heart fluttering with anticipation for the following evening. Daniel slipped into the room, unbuttoning his shirt, and for a brief moment, I saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. He was looking at me the way a man looks at a puzzle he's about to solve. I set my phone down, suddenly uneasy. "You're working late a lot these days?" He chuckled, kicking off his shoes. "So are you." I swallowed, my throat dry. "I have a lot going on." He nodded, climbing into bed beside me. "So do I." His words lingered in the air between us, a warning, a promise, and I should have listened. The night of the country club gala arrived with an air of undeniable anticipation. I had spent hours getting ready, ensuring every detail was perfect, from the deep red silk of my gown to the diamond necklace Nathan had gifted me just a week before. My makeup was flawless, my hair styled in soft waves, framing my face the way I knew made men look twice. As I stepped into the grand ballroom, the murmur of conversation and the soft clinking of glasses filled the space. But my focus was on Nathan. He was already waiting for me near the bar, looking devastatingly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his posture easy, confident, the way he always was. He smirked as I approached, his fingers grazing my wrist before he leaned in, whispering something about how stunning I looked. For a moment, I let myself enjoy the attention, the way his eyes drank me in, the way I felt when I was with him. It was dangerous and exhilarating, a rush of power that I had become addicted to. But then, as I turned, my eyes landed on something that sent an unexpected jolt through me. Daniel was there, not in his usual jeans and work boots, not with the grease-stained hands I had come to associate him with, but in a sharply cut black suit, standing near a group of men who all looked like they belonged in this world. He held a drink in his hand, his posture relaxed, but there was something about the way he carried himself that felt different. He wasn't the man who used to avoid these events, who dismissed them as meaningless. He looked like he belonged. I swallowed, forcing a smile as Nathan led me toward our table, but I could feel Daniel's eyes on me, unwavering. The sensation of being watched made my skin prickle. I kept telling myself he was here because of me, because he had finally started to understand that this was the life I had always wanted. It was the explanation that made the most sense, the one I could accept without letting doubt sink in. As the night went on, I felt myself settling into the comfort of the familiar. Nathan's hand resting on my thigh beneath the table, his touch subtle but deliberate, the way he would lean in when he spoke to me, his lips brushing my ear just enough to send a thrill down my spine. Everything about the night felt like it always had, indulgent and intoxicating. Until I heard the sound of a microphone being tapped, the soft buzz of feedback cutting through the murmur of conversation. I turned my head, my breath catching as I saw Daniel standing at the front of the room, his fingers wrapped around the microphone as he surveyed the crowd with a quiet authority that sent a ripple of unease through me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, controlled, carrying easily through the room. "I won't take up much of your time, but I feel it's necessary to share something with all of you tonight." A hush fell over the room, people exchanging curious glances, the air thick with anticipation. My heart pounded against my ribs, and beside me, Nathan shifted slightly, his body tensing. I tried to steady my breathing, to tell myself that this was just some unexpected speech, nothing more. But then Daniel's eyes found mine, and the quiet knowing in them sent a cold shiver through my spine. "You see," he continued, his tone deceptively casual, "for the past several months, I've had the great pleasure of learning something new, something life-changing, really. I've learned that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who betray you the deepest." There it was. The words struck me like a physical blow, my vision blurring at the edges. The room felt too bright, too loud, too suffocating. A murmur ran through the crowd, people shifting in their seats, glancing around as if trying to piece together the meaning behind his words. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, to not give anything away. But my entire body was rigid with tension. And in learning that, Daniel went on, taking a slow sip of his drink before setting it down on the podium, I also discovered something else. That sometimes the person you think is the fool in the room is the one watching the entire game unfold from the very beginning. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, a deafening thud that drowned out everything else. My fingers curled into the fabric of my dress beneath the table, nails digging into the silk. I wanted to move, to leave, to do anything but sit there as Daniel spoke words that felt dangerously close to unraveling everything I had worked so hard to keep hidden. Nathan shifted beside me, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping against the table in a slow, measured rhythm. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel the tension radiating off him, the awareness that something was about to go terribly, irreversibly wrong. "And so, tonight," Daniel continued, his voice unwavering, his gaze never leaving mine, "I'd like to make a toast, to trust, to honesty, and to the moments when the truth finally comes to light." A waiter stepped forward, holding a tray with glasses of champagne, and I realized, with growing horror, that people were actually raising their glasses, oblivious to the real meaning behind Daniel's words. He lifted his glass, holding it up in the air, his smile slow, deliberate, almost mocking. "To my wife," he said, his voice carrying through the silent room. to the woman I loved, to the woman who taught me a lesson I'll never forget. A few people clapped politely, still unaware of the full weight of what was happening, and I could feel the blood draining from my face, my limbs going cold. I needed to get out. I needed to find a way to stop this before it went any further. But before I could move, before I could even process what was happening, Daniel reached into the pocket of his suit and pulled out a neatly folded stack of papers. "And since we're in such a celebratory mood," he said, unfolding them with careful precision, I thought this would be the perfect time to make things official. I didn't need to see the words to know what they were. The divorce papers, right there in front of everyone. Right there under the crystal chandeliers and the gleaming gold accents of the ballroom, in the midst of our friends, our peers, the very people whose opinions shaped this world we lived in. The air was thick with tension now, the murmurs growing louder as people started to catch on, eyes darting between Daniel and me, the weight of the moment sinking in. My throat was dry, my hands shaking, but I forced myself to lift my chin, to hold on to whatever dignity I had left. Nathan finally spoke, his voice low, edged with something sharp. "This is a mistake." Daniel turned his head slightly, looking at him with an expression so calm it was almost unnerving. "No," he said simply, his voice devoid of any anger, any emotion at all. "The mistake was ever thinking I didn't see this coming." And with that, he set the papers down on the table in front of me, gave me one last look, one final unreadable look, and turned on his heel, walking away as the weight of his actions settled over the room. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. The whispers turned to outright conversations, shocked voices rising around me, the realization spreading like wildfire. I had been exposed, not in private, not in a quiet conversation behind closed doors, but here, in front of everyone, in a way that ensured there would be no coming back from it. Nathan stood adjusting his cufflinks, his jaw clenched. He didn't reach for me, didn't offer comfort. Instead, he stepped away, slipping effortlessly into the crowd, already distancing himself from the disaster I had become. And as I sat there, the divorce papers in front of me, the world watching, the realization hit me with full, crushing force. Daniel had known. He had always known. And he had been waiting for this moment to destroy me. The moment Daniel turned his back and walked away, it was as if the entire world had caved in around me. The room, once filled with laughter and easy conversation, had transformed into a suffocating theater of judgment, where every pair of eyes bore into me, dissecting, whispering, forming their own conclusions about the woman who had just been publicly discarded. My hands trembled as I stared at the divorce papers sitting in front of me, the pristine white pages in unforgiving contrast to the deep crimson of my gown. My breath was shallow, unsteady, my heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. Nathan was gone. He hadn't even given me so much as a reassuring touch or a whispered word before slipping into the crowd, distancing himself from the wreckage of my life. The man who had once made me feel like the most desired woman in the world now couldn't get away fast enough. I looked around, desperate for an anchor, someone to tell me that I could fix this, that this wasn't happening. But all I found were stares, some pitying, others smug, and a few filled with the sick kind of amusement that only came when watching a woman fall from grace. I forced myself to stand, smoothing the fabric of my dress, as if that simple action could somehow restore the dignity that had just been stripped from me. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. I needed to get out, needed air, needed to escape before the whispers turned into something worse. As I made my way toward the exit, a hand reached out and grasped my wrist, gentle but firm. I turned sharply, my stomach dropping when I saw who it was. Evelyn Hastings, the country club's reigning queen. a woman who had always treated me like an amusing pet, someone she tolerated because of my charm, but never truly welcomed into her inner circle. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened slightly around my wrist, her lips curving into something that was not quite a smirk, but nowhere near sympathy. "Oh, darling," she murmured, her voice soft but cutting. "I suppose we all have our little indiscretions, but to have it laid bare like this," she sighed dramatically, shaking her head, "you must be humiliated." I wanted to rip my wrist away, wanted to hurl back something sharp and cruel, but I was too stunned, too raw. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. Evelyn tilted her head, watching me like I was an exotic bird that had lost its feathers, once beautiful but now. "But if it's any consolation," she continued, leaning in just slightly, "I never really believed your husband was as simple as you made him out to be. Quiet men are always the ones to watch." My stomach twisted, nausea threatening to overwhelm me. I yanked my wrist from her grasp and pushed past her, ignoring the muffled laughter that followed. The night air hit me the moment I stepped outside, crisp and unforgiving. I wrapped my arms around myself, the chill biting into my skin, but it did nothing to soothe the ache that had settled deep within me. I had been exposed, humiliated, and worst of all, I had been blind. I thought I had orchestrated everything, played the perfect game, ensured that I was always one step ahead. But Daniel had been watching, calculating, waiting for the precise moment to pull the rug out from beneath me, and he had done it flawlessly. A black car was parked near the entrance, sleek and expensive, and as I stood there, my heart still racing, the driver stepped out and opened the back door. I frowned, taking a step back, until I saw him. Daniel, seated inside, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, as if he hadn't just upended my entire life in the span of a few minutes. He didn't wave me over, didn't beckon me forward, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made it clear he knew I would come, and I hated that he was right. I forced my feet to move, the gravel crunching beneath my heels as I approached the car. My hands were shaking as I gripped the edge of the door before sliding inside, the door shutting with a quiet finality behind me. The air inside was warm, scented with the faintest trace of Daniel's cologne, a scent I had once found comfort in but now felt foreign. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He stared straight ahead, his fingers drumming lightly against the leather seat, his expression unreadable. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tell him he had no right to humiliate me like that, but I knew better. Daniel had always been the kind of man who chose his words carefully, who never let emotions dictate his actions. He had spent months, maybe longer, planning this, and that thought alone sent another shiver through me. "You knew," I finally whispered, my voice barely audible in the silence. "How long?" He turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on me with a calm that was more terrifying than any anger he could have shown. "Long enough." I swallowed, my fingers digging into my lap. "Why didn't you say anything?" He exhaled slowly, tilting his head as if he was genuinely considering the question. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd take it." His words sliced through me, sharp and precise. I felt exposed all over again, like he had stripped me down to my very core, laid bare every secret I had convinced myself was safe. "You wanted to punish me," I accused, my voice trembling. "You wanted to humiliate me." He laughed then, but it wasn't warm. It wasn't the laughter of the man who used to kiss my forehead in the morning before leaving for work, the man who once told me he'd love me even when I didn't deserve it. This was a different Daniel, one I didn't recognize. "You think this is about punishment?" he asked, shaking his head. "You think this is about making you feel small?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to something quieter, something more dangerous. "This isn't punishment, Sophia. This is consequence." I sucked in a sharp breath, my hands clenching into fists. You think you're better than me? I spat, my control slipping. You think just because you got the last word, you win? He studied me for a long moment, then leaned back against the seat, his expression once again unreadable. I didn't have to win, Sophia. You lost the moment you thought I was just a mechanic. The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to lash out, to throw something, to demand that he take it all back, but I knew it wouldn't matter. He had already left me in every way that counted. The car slowed, and I realized we had arrived at our house, except it wasn't our house anymore. I stepped out slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me as I stared up at the place I had called home for years. The front porch light was on, casting a soft glow, but it no longer felt welcoming. Daniel remained in the car, watching me from the open window. "I'll have my things moved out by tomorrow," he said, his voice neutral. "The house is yours." I turned, stunned. "You're leaving?" He gave a slow nod. "There's nothing left here for me." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but for the first time in my life, I had no words. As the car pulled away, disappearing down the road, I realized something that sent a sharp, unbearable pain through my chest. He had been planning this all along. Not just the revelation at the country club, not just the divorce paper. He had been planning to leave me. And he had done it so thoroughly, so carefully that I hadn't even seen it coming. I had played the game, convinced I was winning, but in the end, Daniel had made sure there was only ever one possible outcome. He had walked away whole, and I was the one left in ruins. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of quiet that stretched through empty spaces, filling the air with something heavy and unbearable. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the framed photos on the mantel, at the neat arrangement of furniture, at the life I had built, convinced that it was untouchable. The house still smelled like Daniel. His scent clung to the fabric of the couch, lingered in the air, a cruel reminder that, even though he had walked away, traces of him remained. I wandered through the space, my fingers brushing against surfaces I had never truly noticed before. The worn edges of the coffee table where Daniel had once rested his feet, the kitchen counter where he had stood on lazy Sunday mornings, brewing coffee and humming some tune under his breath. I had spent years thinking of this house as mine, as if Daniel had simply existed in it as an accessory, an afterthought. But now, standing here alone, I realized how much of him had been woven into every part of it, and how, without him, it all felt hollow. I turned slowly, my eyes landing on the envelope sitting on the entryway table, my stomach twisted as I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I reached for it. My name was written in Daniel's careful, precise handwriting, no flourish, no unnecessary details. Just Sophia. I hesitated before opening it, already knowing that whatever was inside was going to cut deeper than I was prepared for. I unfolded the letter, my breath catching as my eyes scanned the words. Sophia, I don't expect you to understand. Not now, maybe not ever. But I want you to know that this was never about revenge. It was never about making you suffer. This was about showing you the truth about me, about you, about the life we built on illusions. You spent so long convincing yourself that I was just a simple man, that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't enough. But I was always watching. I saw you, even when you thought I wasn't looking. I knew when the lies started, when the late nights weren't just dinners with friends, when the perfume on your skin wasn't one I had bought you. I knew, and yet I waited. I waited because I wanted to see if you would stop, if you would turn back, if you would choose me. But you never did. So I made my choice too. I won't hate you. I won't waste my life being bitter or angry. But I also won't spend another moment being the man who let you walk all over him. I built something of my own, Sophia. I was never just a mechanic. I let you believe that because I wanted to see what you valued more, the man or the status. And now I have my answer. Take the house, take whatever you want, but I won't be here anymore. I won't be waiting. I won't be looking back. This is the end. Daniel. I pressed a hand against my mouth, my vision blurring. The weight of his words settled in my chest like a crushing force, pressing down on my ribs, making it impossible to breathe. I had expected anger. I had expected accusations, blame, cruelty, but this was worse. There was no rage in his words, no venom, just the quiet, unwavering certainty of a man who had already moved on. I sank onto the couch, my hands clutching the letter, my mind spiraling back to every moment I had dismissed, every sign I had ignored. How had I been so blind? How had I been so convinced that he was nothing more than a man content with the simplicity of his life, while all along he had been playing a much bigger game? A sob built in my throat, but I swallowed it down. Crying wouldn't change anything. Regret wouldn't rewrite the past. But the regret was there, settling in like an unwelcome guest, whispering all the what-ifs I had refused to acknowledge. I had wanted more. I had craved excitement, luxury, passion, and now I had all the emptiness I could ever ask for. The sound of my phone buzzing jolted me from my thoughts. I blinked, glancing at the screen. Nathan. My fingers curled around the device, my pulse spiking. For a brief second, I considered answering, considered clinging to the one person who had been a part of this reckless, destructive game. But as I stared at his name flashing across the screen, I realized something. Nathan didn't love me. He never had. He had wanted me because I was forbidden, because I was a challenge, because I was something to be taken. And now that I was no longer Daniel's wife, now that I had nothing left to lose, I wasn't worth the chase anymore. I let the phone ring until it went silent, setting it down beside me. I was truly alone now. The following days passed in a blur. The whispers at the country club grew louder, my name passing through lips that once greeted me with admiration but now held nothing but thinly veiled amusement. The invitations stopped coming. The people I once called friends avoided my gaze, their loyalty shifting like the tide. It was cruel, but it was expected. This world was built on perception, and I had been reduced to nothing more than a scandal. I stopped going, stopped trying to hold on to a place that no longer wanted me. Instead, I spent my days wandering through the house, haunted by the echoes of what once was. I opened Daniel's closet one evening, expecting to find his things still there, some part of me clinging to the hope that he had left something behind. But it was empty. He had erased himself completely, and yet I couldn't do the same. I found myself driving past the auto shop one evening, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The lights were still on, the sign out front unchanged, as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis, as if nothing had happened. I parked across the street, my heart hammering in my chest as I watched through the window. Daniel was there. He stood near the front counter, speaking to a man in a suit, his expression unreadable. There was something different about him, something I couldn't quite place. He looked free. I had spent so long believing that I was the one who had trapped him, that he had been stuck in a life that wasn't enough for me. But I realized in that moment that I had been the one clinging to illusions. Daniel had always known who he was. I was the one who had been lost. He turned slightly, his gaze flickering toward the window, and for a split second, our eyes met. I waited for something, a sign, a flicker of recognition, of regret, of anything that said he still saw me. But he simply turned back to his conversation, his expression unchanged, as if I were just another stranger on the street. I exhaled shakily, my chest aching. He was gone, really gone. And for the first time since it all began, I understood what that meant. I had lost him, not just as a husband, not just as a man, but as someone who had once looked at me like I was his entire world. I had thought I wanted freedom. I had thought I wanted something more. But the truth was, I had never understood what I already had. And now it was too late. I pulled away from the curb, driving aimlessly through the streets of a town that no longer felt like mine. I had spent so long believing that I deserved more, that I was meant for a life bigger than the one Daniel had given me. But now, as I stared at the city lights blurring in the distance, I realized something far more painful. I hadn't just lost my husband. I had lost the only person who had ever truly loved me, and I had no one to blame but myself. The days stretched into weeks, and the world moved on without me. The country club carried on with its lavish events. The same women who used to smile at me now whispered behind manicured hands, pretending I no longer existed. The boutiques I once frequented no longer felt like welcoming spaces, the attendants giving me quick, knowing glances before turning away, as if I was no longer worth their attention. The invitations had stopped, the texts dwindled to nothing. My once glamorous life now reduced to silence and empty spaces. I had spent years building an identity that revolved around wealth, status, and admiration, and now, stripped of it all, I realized just how little of myself was left beneath it. I avoided the places where Daniel might be, not because I didn't want to see him, but because I knew I wouldn't be able to handle it. The idea of watching him move on, watching him exist in a world where I no longer mattered, was more than I could bear. But despite my efforts, there were moments I couldn't control. The random encounters in town where I would see him from a distance, speaking to someone outside his shop, laughing in a way that made it seem as if nothing had changed. The fleeting glimpses of him in restaurants, in coffee shops, in places where I had once sat across from him, never realizing that those moments were fleeting, that they wouldn't last forever. One evening I found myself parked outside the auto shop again, watching through the glass as Daniel leaned over the counter speaking to a woman. She was beautiful in an effortless way, the kind of beauty that didn't require designer dresses or expensive jewelry. Her laugh was soft, her posture relaxed, her hand resting on the counter as she spoke to him with ease. And the worst part wasn't that she was there. The worst part was the way he looked at her, the way his expression softened, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the edges like he was truly happy. That used to be me. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached, swallowing against the lump in my throat. I told myself it was ridiculous, that I had no right to feel this way, that I had made my choices and now I had to live with them. But knowing that didn't make it easier. It didn't stop the ache in my chest, the realization that Daniel had done exactly what he said he would. He had moved on, and he had done it without looking back. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my own decisions crushing me. Regret was a slow, merciless poison, and it had seeped into every part of me, curling around my bones, making it impossible to breathe. I had spent so much time chasing something more, convinced that what I had wasn't enough. And now, standing in the ruins of my own choices, I understood the bitter truth. Daniel had been enough. I had just been too blind to see it. The following morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to the small diner on the outskirts of town, the place Daniel and I used to go to before I decided that high-end restaurants and exclusive lounges were more suited to the life I wanted. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pancakes hit me the moment I stepped inside, the familiarity of it sending an unexpected wave of nostalgia through me. I slid into a booth near the window, staring out at the quiet streets, my fingers tracing patterns on the tabletop as I tried to gather my thoughts. I didn't expect to see him. I told myself I wasn't here for that. But when the door swung open and Daniel stepped inside, his presence filling the space in a way that made my breath hitch, I knew deep down that a part of me had hoped for this. He didn't notice me at first, too caught up in conversation with someone behind him. But then his gaze flickered over, and our eyes met. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence between us, a charged stillness that made my chest tighten. He hesitated for only a second before giving a slight nod, nothing more, and then he walked toward the counter, ordering his coffee as if I wasn't even there. The finality of it, the ease with which he carried on, was almost unbearable. I didn't know what I was thinking when I stood, when I crossed the room, when I stopped beside him with my heart hammering in my chest. He turned slightly, one eyebrow lifting, waiting. "Daniel," I said, my voice softer than I intended, my throat tight. "Can we talk?" He exhaled slowly, nodding to the waitress as she handed him his coffee. He took a sip, studying me for a long moment before finally speaking. "I think we already did all the talking we needed to do." I flinched at the coolness in his tone, but I forced myself to push past it. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I have no right to ask for anything after everything I've done, but I just need you to hear me out." He set his cup down, folding his arms across his chest. "All right," he said, tilting his head slightly. "I'm listening." I hadn't thought this far ahead. I had no script, no carefully rehearsed speech, nothing but the raw truth pressing against my ribs, demanding to be spoken. I was wrong, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. About everything. About you. About us. I was so caught up in wanting more that I didn't see what I already had. And now, standing here, I realize that I've ruined the best thing in my life because I was too selfish to appreciate it. He didn't say anything, didn't react. He just watched me, waiting, letting me drown in my own words. "I don't expect you to forgive me," I continued, my throat burning. "I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry, that I regret everything, that I miss you." Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before finally meeting my gaze. "You miss me?" he repeated, his voice even, controlled. "Or do you miss the life you lost?" The question hit me harder than I expected, forcing me to confront the answer I hadn't been ready to face. You, I admitted, the word barely escaping my lips. "I miss you." A long silence stretched between us, heavy with things that could never be undone. He reached for his coffee, taking another slow sip before shaking his head slightly, as if he was trying to make sense of something. "I loved you, Sophia," he said finally, his voice quieter now, softer. "I loved you in a way I don't think you ever understood. And for a long time I thought that love would be enough. But love doesn't mean anything when one person is always looking for an escape." My chest ached at his words, at the truth in them. "I never wanted to escape from you," I whispered. I thought I wanted more." He let out a slow breath, setting his cup down. "And did you find it?" I closed my eyes, shaking my head. "No," I admitted, "because what I had with you was already everything." For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something shift in his gaze, something softer, something that reminded me of the man I used to fall asleep next to, the man who had once looked at me like I was his world. But then it was gone, replaced by quiet resolve. "I hope you find happiness, Sophia," he said, pushing away from the counter. "I really do." And just like that, he was gone. I stood there long after he left, staring at the space he had occupied, knowing deep down that this was the closest I would ever get to redemption. I had been given my answer. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in something far worse, indifference. Daniel had moved on, and I was nothing more than a memory he had long since let go. And that was the real punishment, knowing that the one person I had taken for granted was now the only thing I would never have again. There are moments in life when you realize that the choices you made cannot be undone. Regret is a slow, creeping thing, settling into your bones long after the damage has been done, whispering all the ways you could have chosen differently. I never thought I would be the woman standing in the wreckage of her own decisions, looking back at a love she once had but never appreciated. And yet, here I am, alone. I spent years believing I deserved more passion, more excitement, more attention. I convinced myself that Daniel's quiet love wasn't enough, that his steady presence was something to grow bored of rather than cherish. I spent so long looking for something bigger than the life I had with him that I failed to see the depth of what was right in front of me. Daniel was never just a mechanic. He was never the simple man I painted him to be in my mind. He was strong, patient, observant. He saw me even when I wasn't paying attention to him. And more than that, he loved me in a way I now realize was rare, deep, unwavering, and forgiving, even when I didn't deserve it. But love isn't something you can toy with. It isn't something you can take for granted and expect to always be there. It needs to be nurtured, protected. I thought I could step outside of it, play my games, have my indulgences, and still come back to a man who would always be waiting for me. I was wrong. Love doesn't stay when it isn't valued. And Daniel, despite how much he had loved me, knew his worth. In the end, he chose himself, and that is something I have to live with. I used to believe that losing my status, my social circle, and my reputation was the worst thing that could happen to me, but none of that compares to losing him. Those things are replaceable, fleeting. They were never real in the way that Daniel's love was. What I lost wasn't just my husband. It was the life I could have had if I had been wise enough to see its value. A life where I was loved for who I was, not for who I was trying to impress. A life where I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't. Now, I exist in the aftermath. I go through my days knowing that somewhere Daniel is happy, building a future without me, and I am left with nothing but the knowledge that I caused my own downfall. He has moved on, not out of anger, not out of spite, but because he deserved to. And that is what hurts the most. August. I thought I was playing a game where I held all the power, where I controlled the pieces. But I was wrong. Daniel had been watching, waiting, and in the end, I was the one who lost everything. And now, all I have left is regret. Life after Daniel was different. Not just in the obvious ways like sleeping alone or eating dinner at a quiet table that once held laughter, but in the little moments that used to be insignificant and now felt like gaping wounds, the absence of his car in the driveway, the way the house, though still mine, no longer felt like home, the way I reached for my phone sometimes out of habit only to remember that there was no longer a reason to call him. I thought time would soften the edges of my regret, that eventually I would wake up and not feel the crushing weight of my choices pressing against my chest. But weeks passed, then months, and the feeling remained. It didn't come in waves. It was constant, lingering just beneath the surface of every moment, reminding me that this was the life I had chosen. I tried to move on. I told myself I was still young, still beautiful, still capable of finding love again. Men at the country club, the same ones who used to nod politely at me when I was Mrs. Whitmore, now watched me with interest, sensing vulnerability, seeing an opportunity. But none of them mattered, not really. They weren't Daniel. I didn't have a man. They weren't the man who used to wake up early just to warm up my car on cold mornings, who remembered how I liked my coffee without ever having to ask, who kissed my forehead before leaving for work as if it was just a natural part of his routine. They weren't the man who had once loved me enough to look past my flaws until I gave him no choice but to see them. Nathan reached out once, a casual text asking if I wanted to grab a drink, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't vanished the night my world came crashing down. The man who had once consumed my thoughts now felt like nothing more than a reminder of my mistakes. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Nathan had never been love. He had been a distraction, a fantasy, an escape from a life I had foolishly thought wasn't enough. And now I was left with the cold truth that I had destroyed something real for the sake of something fleeting. I told myself I wouldn't see Daniel again, that it would be easier that way. But life had a cruel sense of humor. One evening, as I walked through the quiet streets of town, I spotted him through the window of a small cafe. He wasn't alone. The woman from the auto shop was sitting across from him, laughing at something he had said, her eyes warm, familiar, the way mine used to be when I looked at him. And Daniel, he was smiling. Not politely, not out of obligation, but the kind of smile that came effortlessly, the kind that meant he was happy. I stood there for a long time, unnoticed, watching a moment I had no right to witness. He was moving on, he had already moved on, and there was nothing left for me to do but accept it. The cafe door opened and a couple walked out, forcing me to take a step back onto the sidewalk. When I turned my gaze back toward the window, Daniel was looking at me. For a single heartbeat, I allowed myself to hope that maybe he would stand, walk toward me, say something, anything, that would mean there was still a chance, that maybe he still thought of me the way I still thought of him. But then, with the same quiet certainty he had carried the night he exposed my affair, he simply nodded before turning back to the woman across from him. That was it? No anger, no hatred, not even sadness. Just a nod. The final thread between us severed. I walked away, my hands trembling at my sides, my breath uneven, knowing there would be no going back. He wasn't mine anymore. And for the first time, I understood that he never really had been. Love was never something to be owned, to be kept in a gilded cage and expected to stay the same. It had to be nurtured, protected, cherished. And I had let ours die long before Daniel had walked away. That night, I sat in my empty house, the silence stretching endlessly around me, and I allowed myself to cry for everything I had lost. Not just Daniel, but the version of myself that had once been worthy of him. The woman who had stood beside him at the beginning, who had loved him before she became blinded by greed and selfishness. That woman was gone now, and in her place was someone I barely recognized. Time continued forward, indifferent to my pain. The seasons changed, the world moved on, and I had no choice but to do the same. I sold the house eventually, unable to live in the ghost of what had been. I moved into a smaller place, something less grand, something that forced me to sit with myself in ways I had never done before. I heard about Daniel through whispers, that his business was thriving, that he had expanded, bought new locations, built something bigger than the small auto shop he had once run, that he was happy. And I never reached out, never tried to interfere with the life he had rebuilt, because he had been right. He had spent years loving me when I hadn't deserved it, and in the end, he had chosen himself. I had once thought that love was something that could be taken for granted, that it would always be there waiting no matter how much I tested its limits. But love, true love, isn't something that can be treated like an afterthought. It isn't something that survives deception, betrayal, or neglect, and when it's gone, when the person who once held you in their arms decides they can no longer carry the weight of your choices, there is no way to get it back. Daniel was my greatest loss, not because he left, but because I had given him every reason to. And the worst part wasn't that he had moved on. It was that I knew I never really would. There are some mistakes you can come back from, wounds that time can heal, bridges that, though burned, can still be rebuilt. But not this, not what I had done. Some betrayals are too deep, too irreversible, leaving scars that never truly fade. I had learned that the hard way. I used to think love was permanent, that once someone loved you, truly loved you, they could never stop. But love doesn't work that way. It's fragile, something to be nurtured, not tested, not toyed with. And when you take it for granted, when you break it over and over again, you don't get to be surprised when it finally shatters beyond repair. I had lost Daniel, not in some dramatic, storming out the door kind of way, but in a much crueler, more painful way. He had stopped loving me. Or maybe he still loved me, just not in a way that meant anything anymore. Maybe his love had shifted into something distant, like the kind you feel for an old memory, something you once cherished but have long since put away. Maybe if someone asked him about me years from now, he'd think of me with a small, fleeting sadness before moving on with his day, unaffected. But me, I would never stop feeling this loss. It had settled into my bones, woven itself into the fabric of my existence. There was no escaping it. Some people move on easily, find a new love, a new purpose. But I knew deep down that no matter where I went, no matter who I met, there would always be a hollow space inside me where Daniel used to be. I tried to imagine a future where I didn't wake up with regret as my first thought. A future where I didn't see him in the faces of strangers, didn't hear his voice in the quiet spaces of my mind, didn't wonder constantly what my life would have looked like if I had chosen differently. But I couldn't. That was my reality now. I left town a few months later, not because I was running from him. There was nothing left to run from, but because I could no longer exist in the places that once belonged to both of us. Every street, every cafe, every familiar corner was haunted by a version of myself that had once been whole, by a life I had thrown away. I packed lightly, taking only what I needed, leaving behind the remnants of a life that no longer fit me. The house, the country club, the empty friendships. I let them all go. None of it had ever really mattered, not the way I once thought it did. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. There was no one left to say it to. But before I left, I did one last thing. I wrote a letter to Daniel. I didn't expect him to read it, didn't expect him to care. But I needed to say the words even if they would never reach him. Daniel, I don't expect anything from you, not a response, not forgiveness, not even a second thought. But I need you to know that I understand now. I understand what I did, what I lost, what I will never get back. And I need you to know that I am sorry, truly, deeply sorry. You were the best thing in my life, and I was too blind to see it. You deserved more than I ever gave you, and I have to live with the fact that I will never be able to make that right. But I hope that wherever you are, whoever you're with, you are happy. I hope you have found someone who sees you the way I should have seen you, and I hope you never doubt that despite everything, I did love you. I just didn't know how to show it until it was too late. I won't bother you again. I won't ask for anything. I just wanted you to know the truth. Tothia. I left the letter on his doorstep the night before I left. I didn't wait around to see if he found it. Maybe he read it. Maybe he threw it away without a second glance. It didn't matter. It wasn't for him. It was for me. And as I drove away from the town where I had built and destroyed my life, I didn't look back. Because I already knew what was behind me. Nothing but regret.